Hi everyone, it's Ren here. Hope you're doing well, guys. Welcome to my room again. I'm not going to talk about the weather today because some people are making fun of me for this little habit that I have. But in answer to the questions, like, is that on purpose that you do that? I don't know what it is. I've never really explained it. I like talking about the weather. I think talking about the weather is underrated because there's a link between the weather and heaven if you think about it, and heaven is a big thing, so like weather is the veil of heaven. I don't know, I think there's something significant about the commonplace conversations people have about the weather. I would much rather talk about the weather than talk about a lot of other small talky things that I could not care about. Anyway, that's not the topic of today. The topic of today is going to be anxiety because I think this topic has been mentioned to me in the comments quite a few times, and I gathered from it that there was some demand for treatment of the topic. Now, I guess maybe the reason why I delayed it for a while was that I wasn't quite sure how to tackle it in a way that was interesting or new or exciting conceptually. But these days, I've come to realize that if I want to contribute something new and conceptually interesting on absolutely every topic that I could talk about, well, I'll soon come to the realization that I'm running short of ideas about what I can legitimately do in that way, because one cannot have an exciting original perspective on everything. And so that explains my decision that you probably have noticed more recently to tackle a lot of topics more as taken from my experience, because the idiosyncrasy of my own experience guarantees its singularity and therefore its originality in a way. And if I can pepper it with some insights, of course, I'll do that, and I'll be hoping to do that in this video. So, anxiety and the INFJ. Anxiety in Ren, who is an INFJ, would be probably more correct. So how do I relate to anxiety? First of all, would I consider myself to be an anxious person? Most certainly. I'm an anxious person. I've always been a pretty anxious person. And I would say that until recently, I wasn't even that good at dealing with this anxiety, at dealing with it, making it less impactful on my being, on my everyday life, because I guess I didn't really allow myself to, to find a way to address it properly. Not doing enough in high intensity physical activity is definitely one contributor. Not having a job that I liked was definitely another contributor. Being HSP, being a highly sensitive person, especially to, I would say, especially to sensory stimuli, but also, and actually more over time, to emotional stimuli, especially the emotions of others. What we call this unique brand of INFJ empathy, which is to feel the emotions, or the sort of like, the little waves, of emotional positivity or negativity in a room as they transport themselves from people to people. We have this weird ability to attract them and to feel them without necessarily feeling sympathetic towards the person who emits them, but just almost by default kind of being very exposed to that emotionality. So obviously that happens to me, and I have to shield myself from it a little bit, which is why I'm notoriously not good at dealing with people who may not have any intention to be mean to me or to be harmful to me, but who, by the fact that they kind of, some of them are come across quite unstable and unhealthy, and that's happened in real life, but also online. I kind of just have to block them. I kind of have to block them to not allow myself to be exposed to their content, because it's just too stressful for me. Like, I just cannot cope. It's too hard, and it's not. I'm not doing it out of egoism, but really more because it's a boundary that I consider to be pretty vital. Now, rest assured, I'm not doing this to everyone. It's probably a case out of thousands, but it has happened. It's happened on YouTube, and it's also happened in reality on forums. There are some people who emit a certain kind of negative emotionality, these waves that I can sort of quickly absorb via NIFE, I think, principally, and that can ruin my day, or that can definitely augment the level of stress or anxiety that I am experiencing, and I can feel it physiologically. So that's definitely another aspect on top of work that can sometimes be stressful, especially if I don't like it. And of course, these things can combine. Imagine that you don't like your work. So for example, I didn't really like my work, and I went through a phase that was particularly stressful for me, so stressful that I ended up having a bit of a burnout, and I had to go on sick leave for a few weeks. It was last year. I didn't particularly like my work. I felt frustrated at my work, so I was overcompensating at work because I was kind of dealing with some bore out. So that was anxiety inducing. I was subjecting myself to stress. I was compensating afterwards when I was going back home by doing some intellectual activity that interested me, but that ended up being more effort instead of just taking a break, chilling after a certain time, which is important. So that puts even more stress on my physical condition. And I was dealing with a certain boss, not my direct manager, but somebody else in the organization, higher placed, who was, I found, to be extremely toxic in terms of emitting negative emotion, ridding himself of that negative emotion and feeling good afterwards, after tantrums or complaints or whatever, that were not necessarily aimed at anyone in particular, but the empaths in the room, I can assure you, they all felt really shaken afterwards, and certain empaths, particularly me and my direct manager, who actually happens to be both INFJs, we really were, I think, the two who brought those negative waves home, and we both found it very difficult to deal with that person in that situation, and that contributed to this explosive sort of mix that just had me resign from my job. I had to resign, and although I took another job afterwards, I think that was a forewarning sign that I was not quite happy with my job, my professional situation. So I don't know if this is the case with all INFJs in the world, whether having like a sort of recurrent dissatisfaction with on not meaningful work can be a source of anxiety. It certainly was for me. So it would suggest that if that's the case for an INFJ who tends to be so preoccupied with not just having certainly not having only a job that pays a lot. I don't think that's actually high in the hierarchy of priorities of most INFJs. Not necessarily having a job that affords social status. I don't think that would rank particularly high in the priorities of an INFJ. But having a job that is meaningful. So having a job that one feels one is not really wasting one's time doing. That is a job that is not just a job. A job that is somehow making sense as part of one's life, as an intrinsic part of one's life, and that doesn't. If that doesn't line up, at least for me, that can create anxiety in itself, and for the compensation that it leads to. Then mixed with the negative energy that other people can emit. Like I said, if I spot these people from a mile away and I can do it, I will usually block them somehow because I cannot deal with it. Of course, that requires several instances of that, expression of negative energy, not just once. And I would say then, like, there's another aspect to anxiety for me which is a great source of it. And of course, there's the HSP dimension, especially noises, but also emotions. But noises like sound, like shrill sound, certain types of sound, repetitive sounds, strong smells, and just in general, like and my mom is a little bit like that. I think my mom is HSP as well, and if she's not, she's very close. She's an ISFP herself, but like, say, imagine that some kind of food is a little bit fat and a bit heavy, like we would feel kind of bad easily compared to other people who might say, okay, yeah, it was a bit fat, it was a bit greasy, but it's okay, once in a while is fine. I would agree with that. It's just that I would feel it so a bit more strongly. You can imagine it also manifests itself. I was talking about the weather earlier, but imagine that I wake up and the weather is really bad, and it's been a few days, it's been really bad. Most people would be kind of dejected as a result in some respects, but I think that I'm particularly sensitive to that kind of thing as well. So it's a whole conglomerate of sensitive things which can often translate into anxiety. And the fourth thing that I wanted to mention before I deviated into going back to HSP is, there's a phrase in a Jordan Peterson video. He says something at one point that really spoke to me, and he actually himself, he related it, and you're probably familiar with the fact that a lot of people think he's an INFJ. He says, I thought that just hit home so much. He said, deviations from expectations create or induce negative emotion, and if you let them pile up, it's a little bit like in the case of anger, it ends up exploding. Instead of having a temper tantrum, you're going to have a panic attack, for instance, or symptoms of early burnout, or these things. So that's very much the case for me. This deviations from expectation can create negative energy. Now, on the surface, I think that applies to, again, that piece of information that Peterson was talking about, was giving. It was not meant to be solely applied to INFJs. He himself doesn't really think much of the MBTI system at this point. But there's still something about it that I think can be considered through an MBTI lens. You might say, oh, that seems to make reference to SI. And I think the reason why is because SI tends to be associated with routine, and therefore you could imagine that someone who is very routine oriented, and I'm one of these people, despite not being an SI dominant, an SI dominant especially would probably experience some anxiety as a result of experiencing deviations from those paths of routine that have been well delineated to begin with and have been sort of subscribed to throughout their lives and stuff. And this is where I would like to distinguish between maybe the deviations of routine for the INFJ and how I experience it. Because I experience perhaps the greatest deal of anxiety as a result of those little jabs. They're little like knife pokes, or little stabs. They're not very strong, but added together they can create a feeling of pressure inside my chest, where like there is just an accumulation of these little deviations. They're not deviations from routine in the sense that I have because I thought about this quite a bit. They're not deviations from routine in terms of me wanting to do my things and not being able to do my things. It looks like it's at a certain level, but I think that level, albeit not a superficial level, is more superficial than a slightly deeper level, deeper layer, which I would define as my NI tendency to want to keep to environments where my ideation, or where my free-floating anti-fluxolite ideation can remain as free as it is. So imagine that you're in an environment where you feel like you're really sort of cornered, and you're expected to do things a certain way, and it has a certain number of tasks following one another and stuff like that. I think unless I don't, might actually quite like that. For me, it is one of the greatest sources of anxiety possible, because sure, I'm made quite anxious by deviations from expectations, but my expectations are not, if you like, my expectations lack an object. So it's not that I have expectations about doing a certain tasks, it's that my expectation is freedom, in a way. Being unshackled, being untethered. And it's something that I expect also. So a deviation from my expectation would not be a deviation from my regular tasks, but regular tasks imposed from outside that I have not had time to process inside my own mind and made sense of by myself as part of a schedule, and that I take a lot of time to make. I'm not a very proficient TE user, and I think that maybe is the difference between an INFJ and for example, like an ENFP. There's a great article by AJ Drenth on Personality Junkie that compares, and I've said this before, but I think this actually is a key to really understanding an INFJ. The article compares the inner mind of an INFJ in this case, or at least I think maybe it's an IJ, but let's say an INFJ and an ENFP. So the inner mind, the mind of an INFJ with the external world of an ENFP. So if you could imagine that the same craving for spontaneity and freedom and flux-likeness that constitutes what we would think as the archetypal ENFP's external world, a desire, for example, to not really stay in the same place too often and do a lot of visiting, a lot of different places, always wanting to try new things in the world, right? That defines their external world. The exact same thing applies to the INFJ's internal world, the world of the mind. And that's the opposition between NI and NE, or the contrast. There's a craving for freedom in both cases, but and a craving for free floatingness, for the flux, for a certain kind of freedom from too much structure in both cases. But in the case of the ENFP and the ENTP, by the way, it is external. In the case of the INFJ and the INTJ, it is internal. And so, just in the same way that an ENFP and an ENTP are likely to want to be free to experiment with lots of new stuff in the world, and would experience anxiety as a result of not having that opportunity, I think an INFJ and probably an INTJ, although I cannot speak for them, and I think their TE might be helpful in dealing with the potential anxiety that could come from that, whereas the INFJ does not have the TE available, unfortunately, as much. But I think the stress here would come from environments in which the variables that set the environment are such that it is the internal world that is shackled, that is prevented from having the freedom that it enjoys. And so, for example, I'm not someone who is adventurous in the sense that an ENFP is adventurous in the world, in trying new things. I mean, I want to try more things that I currently try, and I'm not as adventurous as I could be, and I definitely want to be. It's always helpful to get outside one's comfort zone a bit. But I would say that inside here, there's a lot of adventurousness, a lot of freedom, a lot of desire to remain unshackled in a way. And that's most of the time what I've experienced, especially in workplaces, but also it can be in all sorts of environments where that freedom is shackled. That stresses me out a lot. And it's connected with the NI of the INFJ. So I always like to have my little you could imagine my body, and I like to go places and have my routines, but there's always a kind of big NI bubble around me where I like to float about, despite the fact that I don't actually go to 1,000 new places all the time. It's just that the movement inside this bubble has to be free, and if it is constrained by outside, that's going to stress me out. So that would be my account of how I experience anxiety. Anxiety as HSP, anxiety as deviations from expectations of free-floatingness, not of routine in the SI sense. Anxiety coming from absorption of other people's emotions, so all these different parts, and anxiety coming from too much dependence for, say, one's living or whatever, de facto dependence on an activity that is not meaningful in my eyes. So perhaps we can define them as 4. Lack of meaning, HSP, absorbing other people's emotions, and deviations from routine, but the routine being itself an open routine, a routine of constant openness to things, okay? So now the question is how to address this, since I also linked that with what could contribute to bouts of anger if too much negative energy, negative emotionality is allowed to accumulate inside oneself. I would say the key here is probably to begin with the cultivation of self-awareness, because all that I just described, it ultimately breaks down in triggers. External environments has triggers us, increases our anxiety because it pokes at these different parts: the HSP part, the empath part, the looking for meaning part, the deviations from free floatingness part. It's always little pokes. Now, if you can identify those triggers, if you can identify and you can tell, okay, this is the trigger, this is what is making me anxious, then you can start to think about how to develop coping mechanisms. So maybe in some cases what you would need to do is to try to expose yourself as little as possible to those things, to those negative stimuli. For example, let's say if you're an empath, someone who really stresses you out, someone who creates a lot of negative energy inside you and who lets you take it home for their own benefits because they will no longer feeling once they've expressed it. Well, these people are probably people that you will never become used to, honestly. And so it's important to be able to just say, okay, like, even if this person sometimes, this person's nice in other ways, I'm just gonna say goodbye to this relationship. Maybe that's also a door slam thing, but I didn't expect to say that. But now that I mention it, it kind of sounds like it. But yeah, and to just grieve whatever this relationship. But some relationships are toxic and harmful for us, even when the person is not necessarily mean. And that's something that we need to keep in mind. I think we need to be kind of unforgiving. Not unforgiving, sorry, but we need to be a little bit unflinching. We need to be inflexible, regardless of whether a person is nice or not, about whether they make us feel good or not. I think more than most times, it's a question that we need to ask ourselves and to make the right decisions. And then for other little triggers, more self-awareness, more awareness of these triggers, and the ability to take a bit of distance and to see them for what they are, rather than being directly thrown into an anxious mode without having quite been able to identify them, because FE does not help emotional introspection. I'll be honest, for me, taking antidepressants for a time, I'm still on them, but I'm thinking of no longer using them, but has allowed me to have that extra little bit of a distance. So I got some biochemical help to get that bit of distance, to be able to see the triggers for what they are, so I can learn to negotiate them. In some cases, it's like, okay, I'll just cut loose and no longer deal with them, avoid these things. In other cases, maybe avoidance is not the best approach. Maybe the best approach is to learn how to no longer be triggered by these things. Sometimes the solution is definitely not repression, never is repression, but other times it's also not avoidance. It's learning learning to understand the origins of these stressors. And that's also why psychologists and psychotherapists and counselors of all kinds are very important, because they will help you get to the bottom sort of processes, unconscious processes that create these anxiety triggers. Now, they don't create the anxiety triggers, but they make them into triggers to your own anxiety and increase it. So there's a lot of work, but I hope that was helpful anyway. It's a long video. I'll stop here. Let me know what you think in the comments, guys. See you soon. Have a lovely end of the day.